What do historians like to talk about on dates? Your answer, the good old days. You get it because they're historians talking about history. Okay, you're on board. Fantastic stuff. The Great Society, that's the topic of today's discussion. The concepts of the discussion are as follows. Who is Lyndon B. Johnson? We should know him because of the assassination of JFK. Then, what are the main goals of the Great Society? Were the goals reached? And then, what impact did the program have? And then, finally, what are the specifics of the Great Society program? These are some of the things that were passed during these Great Society years. Civil Rights Act of 1964. Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Immigration Act of the same year. Kennedy is assassinated late in 1962. And the guy who takes over for him is Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson was the vice president at the time. And when he takes over, he has this idea or thought that he wants to really just follow through a lot on what JFK wanted to accomplish while making his own mark known. Okay, so he's going to follow through with a lot of the same international foreign policy things regarding the Cold War. At the same time, he's going to pursue some of these civil rights problems that are in existence and coming to a head in the 1960s. And the Great Society program is the dominant feature for the domestic policy of Lyndon B. Johnson, as it is going to fight anti-poverty. And you can see that down below that chart is a little graph on the budget of the United States, the federal budget, and how it's attacking poverty over the years, really since the Great Society comes into practice in the 1960s. The Great Society program, this, maybe above all else, is going to fight poverty in the United States. But when you're going to fight poverty in the United States during the 1960s, there's going to be a heavy focus on discrimination and racism. And that is what Lyndon B. Johnson is going to tackle while he is trying to implement whatever he can through the Great Society program. For the government, this is the largest government program since FDR's New Deal back during the Great Depression. So the size and scope of this is really quite large. As for the focus areas, poverty, already mentioned, that's going to be a main focus. And then discrimination, racism, that's going to be a focus almost by default. But it's also going to look into some other things regarding housing, what's going on in the cities, education, environment. Uh, so there's the Great Society program, like mentioned already, it is very large in scope and has a lot of different areas that it's going to put its focus on. For example, the Civil Rights Act in '64. This is going to try and tackle discrimination in housing and discrimination in jobs, something that has greatly hurt the African American community in the 1960s and well before that. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's going to be that's a bill that's going to try and tackle some of the Jim Crow laws. That this one outlaws literacy tests that are supposed to be passed prior to being able to vote. This is something that the during the Reconstruction era was created in order to prevent newly freed slaves from being able to vote because they were not brought up with an education, and therefore it was a way to skirt around the law of not disallowing people to vote, but putting a qualifier on those who could actually get in the voting booth. And then the Immigration Act in 1965, this ended national origins quota and is going to allow for another change in immigration. Um, There have been many changes throughout the history of the United States, and here is another one. Um, as for successes that the Great Society program has, the government is addressing in a more specific term, and through legislation, is addressing the civil rights shortcomings that stemmed from the Civil War era. So what I mean by that is there were amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th, specifically the 14th and 15th amendments, that were trying to give civil rights to everybody in the United States of America. And those fell short of working, but it took approximately 100 years for the full rights of these amendments to be realized. And that's saddening. It's disappointing, to say the least. Um, Another success is that there is specifically in the 1950s, even though we've seen civil rights movements before, in the 1950s, there was a civil rights movement, a grassroots movement, started with the citizens, started with African Americans fighting for their rights, and this blossomed into affecting the government into action. Okay, it forced the government to take legislative action, and thus we get something like the Great Society, where the government is taking a much bigger action, bigger than it ever has before. Um, Challenges, it's going to start to create a bigger budget deficit because this is a government program. It takes money to run these programs, therefore the deficit begins to grow. There's a conservative backlash over more government programs and government having more control, and that will eventually lead to a conservative movement that becomes very big, starting really with Richard Nixon, but definitely into the 80s with Ronald Reagan. Um, and one of the thoughts behind it is it really society's fault that there are poor people in the United States, and does all of society have to chip in to take care of these problems? Whose responsibility really is that? It's an idea that is still forced upon us today. There are poor people in the United States. Whose fault is it? Is it anybody's fault? And what are the solutions? Which really gets at the point of whether or not the Great Society is a successful program or not. It definitely depends on your point of view. There are lots of numbers online that poverty has gone down, for example, but we still have large numbers of minorities that struggle with poverty and discrimination, to say the least. So, was it successful? It's really going to depend on your point of view. So, take a look into it, and we need to figure this out, whether it was or was not successful, so we either continue forward with similar programs, or do we take a step back and try something different, or does the government step back totally? Okay, lots of ideas out there. That's it for the Great Society.